Today is May 15th. I'm Serena, and welcome to the Seven Streams Bible Reading Method. We're in the Nation Stream today, reading from the book of 2 Samuel. Not written by Samuel, because he wasn't alive, but it's called 2 Samuel nonetheless. We'll be reading chapters 16 through 20, and things have just gotten really rocky in David's kingdom, and we are going to find out more about what's happening. We're reading from the Common English Bible today, and we'll start 2 Samuel 16. When David had passed a short distance beyond the summit, Ziba, Mephibosheth's servant, met him with a pair of saddled donkeys loaded with 200 loaves of bread, 100 bunches of raisins, 100 figs, and a jar of wine. "What is all this for?" the king asked Ziba. "The donkeys are for the royal family to ride," Ziba explained. "The bread and summer fruit are for the young people to eat, and the wine is for those who get exhausted in the wilderness." "Where is your master's grandson?" the king asked. "He is still in Jerusalem," Ziba answered the king, "because he thinks that the Israelites are now going to give his grandfather's kingdom back to him." "Look here," the king said to Ziba. "Everything that belonged to Mephibosheth now belongs to you." Ziba said, "I bow out of respect. Please think well of me, my master and king." When King David came to Bahurim, a man from the same clan as Saul's family came out from there. His name was Shimei. He was Gera's son. He was cursing as he came out. He threw rocks at David and at all of King David's servants, even though the entire army and all the warriors were on either side of him. This is what Shimei said as he cursed David. "Get out of here! Get out of here! You are a murderer. You are despicable. The Lord has paid you back for all the blood of Saul's family in whose place you rule, and the Lord has handed the kingdom over to your son Absalom. You are in this trouble because you are a murderer." Zeruiah's son Abishai said to the king, "Why should this dead dog curse my master the king? Let me go over and cut his head off." But the king said, "My problems aren't yours, you sons of Zeruiah. If he is cursing because the Lord told him to curse David, then who is to question, why are you doing this?" Then David addressed Abishai and all his servants. "Listen, my own son, one of my very own children, wants me dead. This Benjaminite can only feel the same, only more. Leave him alone, and let him curse, because the Lord told him to. Perhaps the Lord will see my distress. Perhaps the Lord will repay me with good for this cursing today." So David and his men kept walking, while Shimei went along on the hillside next to him, cursing as he went, throwing rocks and dirt at him. The king and all the people who were with him reached the Jordan River exhausted, and he rested there. Now Absalom and all the Israelites entered Jerusalem, and Ahithophel was with him. Then David's friend, Hushai, who was from Erech, approached Absalom and said to him, "Long live the king! Long live the king!" But Absalom said to Hushai, "Is this how you show loyal love to your friend? Why didn't you go with him?" "No," Hushai replied to Absalom. "I will belong to the one chosen by the Lord, by this people, and by all Israel, and I will stay with him. What's more, whom should I serve if not David's son? I served your father, and so I will serve you in the same way." Then Absalom said to Ahithophel, "Give your advice then. What should we do?" "Have sex with your father's secondary wives, the ones he left to take care of the palace," Ahithophel told Absalom. "Then all Israel will hear that you have alienated yourself from your father, and everyone who supports you will be encouraged." So they set up a tent for Absalom on the roof, and he had sex with his father's secondary wives in plain sight before all Israel. Now in those days, the advice Ahithophel gave was like asking for a word from God. That's why Ahithophel's advice was valued by both David and Absalom. Then Ahithophel said to Absalom, "Let me pick 12,000 men, and I will go after David tonight. I will attack him while he is tired and weak, and I will throw him into a panic. All the troops with him will run off. I promise to kill the king alone, and I will bring all the people back to you, like a bride comes back to her husband. It's only one man's life you are seeking. Everyone else can be at peace." This plan seemed excellent to Absalom and the Israelite elders. But Absalom said, "Call Hushai from Erech. Let's hear what he has to say as well." When Hushai from Erech arrived, Absalom said to him, "This is what Ahithophel has advised. Should we follow it or not? What do you say?" Hushai said to Absalom, "This time, the advice Ahithophel has given isn't right. You know that your father and his men are warriors," he continued, "and they are as desperate as a wild bear robbed of her cubs. Your father is a seasoned fighter. He won't spend the night with his troops. Even now, he has probably hidden himself in one of the caves or some other place. When some of those troops fall in the first attack, whoever hears it will say, 'The soldiers who follow Absalom have been defeated.' Then even the bravest soldier, whose heart is like a lion's, will melt in fear, because all Israel knows that your father is a warrior, and that those who are with him are brave. So I would advise that all the Israelites from Dan to Beersheba, a group as countless as sand on the seashore, be summoned to join you, and that you yourself go into battle. When we attack him wherever he might be, we will fall on him like dew that falls on the ground. No one will survive, not him, and not one of the soldiers who are with him. If he retreats into a city, all Israel will bring ropes to that city, and we will drag it into a valley until not even a pebble of it will be found." Then Absalom and everyone in Israel agreed. The advice from Hushai from Erech is better than Ahithophel's advice. This was because the Lord had decided to counter Ahithophel's good advice so that the Lord could bring disaster on Absalom. Hushai told the priests Zadok and Abiathar, "Here is what Ahithophel advised Absalom and the Israelite elders, and here is what I advised. Now, send word immediately to David and tell him, 'Don't spend the night in the desert plains. You must cross over immediately. Otherwise, the king and all the troops who are with him will be swallowed up whole.'" Jonathan and Ahimaaz were standing by at En-Rogel. A female servant would come and report to them, and they would then travel and report to King David, because they couldn't risk being seen entering the city. But a boy saw them and reported it to Absalom. So the two of them left immediately and came to a man's house at Bahurim. He had a well in his courtyard, and they climbed down into it. The man's wife took a covering and spread it over the well's opening, then scattered grain over it so no one would notice. When Absalom's servants came to the woman at the house, they demanded, "Where are Ahimaaz and Jonathan?" The woman told them, "They crossed over the stream." They looked for them, but found nothing, so they returned to Jerusalem. After they had left, Jonathan and Ahimaaz climbed out of the well. They went and reported to King David, "Get up, cross the water immediately, because Ahithophel has made plans against you." So David and all the troops who were with him got up and crossed the Jordan River. By daybreak there was no one left who hadn't crossed the Jordan. Meanwhile, once Ahithophel saw that his advice hadn't been followed, he saddled his donkey and went home to his own town. He gave instructions to his household, then hanged himself and died. He was buried in his father's tomb. David had reached Mahanaim by the time Absalom and all the Israelites who were with him crossed the Jordan River. Absalom had put Amasa in charge of the army instead of Joab. Amasa was the son of a man named Ithra, an Ishmaelite who had married Abigail, who was Nahash's daughter and the sister of Zeruiah, Joab's mother. Israel and Absalom camped in the territory of Gilead. When David arrived in Mahanaim, Nahash's son Shobi, who was from Rabbah of the Ammonites, Amiel's son Machir, who was from Lo-debar, and Barzillai, the Gileadite from Rogelim, brought couches, basins, and pottery, along with wheat, barley, flour, roasted grain, beans, lentils, honey, curds, sheep, and cheese from the herd, so that David and the troops who were with him could eat. They said, "The troops have grown hungry, tired, and thirsty in the wilderness." Then David gathered the troops who were with him and appointed unit commanders over thousands and hundreds. David sent out the army, a third under Joab's command, a third under the command of Abishai, Zeruiah's son, and a third under the command of Ittai the Gittite. The king told the troops, "I will march out with you myself." But the troops replied, "No, you must not march out. If we flee, they won't care about us. Even if half of us die, they won't care about us. But you are worth 10,000 of us. It is much better if you support us from the city." The king said to them, "I will do whatever you think is best." So the king stood beside the gate as all the troops marched out by hundreds and thousands. The king gave orders to Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, "For my sake, protect my boy Absalom." All the troops heard what the king ordered regarding Absalom to all the commanders. So the troops marched into the field to meet the Israelites. The battle was fought in the Ephraim forest. The army of Israel was defeated there by David's soldiers. A great slaughter of 20,000 men took place that day. The battle spread out over the entire countryside, and the forest devoured more soldiers than the sword that day. Absalom came upon some of David's men. Absalom was riding on a mule, and the mule went under the tangled branches of a large oak tree. Absalom's head got caught in the tree. He was left hanging mid-air while the mule under him kept on going. One of the men saw this and reported to Joab, "I just saw Absalom hanging from an oak tree." Joab said to the man who told him, "You saw this? Why didn't you kill him on the spot? I would have given you 10 pieces of silver and a belt." But the man said to Joab, "Even if I had 1,000 pieces of silver in my hand, I wouldn't touch the king's son. We heard what the king commanded you, Abishai and Ittai. For my sake, take care of my boy Absalom. If I had taken Absalom's life behind the king's back, then, though nothing is hidden from the king, you would have kept your distance from me." Joab said, "I won't waste time like this with you." He took 3 sticks in his hand and drove them into Absalom's chest while he was still alive in the oak. Then 10 young armor-bearers of Joab surrounded Absalom, struck him, and killed him. Then Joab sounded the trumpet, and the troops stopped chasing the Israelites because Joab held them back. They took Absalom and threw him into a big pit in the forest. They piled over him a huge heap of stones. Meanwhile, all the Israelites fled to their homes. While he was alive, Absalom had raised a large pillar for himself in the king's valley because he said, "I have no son to carry on the memory of my name." He named the pillar after himself. It is called Absalom's monument to this day. Then Zadok's son Ahimaaz said, "Please, let me run and take the news to the king that the Lord has vindicated him against his enemy's power." Joab said to him, "You aren't the one to bring the news today. You can bring news on another day, but not today, because the king's son is dead." Then Joab said to a Cushite, "Go, tell the king what you have seen." The Cushite bowed low before Joab, then ran off. But Zadok's son Ahimaaz again said to Joab, "I don't care what happens. Just let me run after the Cushite too." "Why do you want to go, son?" Joab asked. "You'll get no reward for going." "I don't care what happens. I want to go," Ahimaaz said. So Joab said to him, "Run off then." Ahimaaz ran off, going by the way of the plain and past the Cushite. Now David was sitting between the two gates. The watchman on duty went up on the roof of the gate by the wall. He looked out and saw a man running alone. The watchman called out and reported this to the king. The king said, "If he's alone, it's good news." The man got nearer and nearer, and the watchman saw another man running and called down to the gatekeeper, "There's another man running alone." The king said, "That one must be bringing good news too." The watchman said, "I can see that the first one runs like Zadok's son Ahimaaz." "He is a good man," the king said, "and he is coming with good news." Ahimaaz called out to the king, "Peace," then bowed low before the king, his nose to the ground. He said, "Bless the Lord your God, who has delivered up the men who raised their hands against my master the king." The king said, "Is my boy Absalom okay?" Ahimaaz said, "I saw a large crowd right when Joab, the king's servant, sent your servant off, but I don't know what it was about." "Step aside and stand right here," the king said. So Ahimaaz stepped aside and waited. Then the Cushite arrived and said, "My master the king, listen to this good news. The Lord has vindicated you this day against the power of all who rose up against you." The king said to the Cushite, "Is my boy Absalom okay?" The Cushite answered, "May the enemies of my master the king and all who rise up against you to hurt you end up like that young man." The king trembled. He went up to the room over the gate and cried. As he went, he said, "Oh, my son Absalom! Oh, my son, Absalom! If only I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." Joab was told that the king was crying and mourning Absalom. So the victory that day was turned into mourning for all the troops, because they heard that day that the king was grieving for his son. So that day the troops crept back into the city, like soldiers creep back ashamed after they've fled from battle. The king covered his face and cried out in a loud voice, "Oh, my son Absalom! Oh, Absalom, my son, my son!" Joab came to the king inside and said, "Today you have humiliated all your servants who have saved your life today, not to mention the lives of your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your secondary wives, by loving those who hate you and hating those who love you. Today you have announced that the commanders and their soldiers are nothing to you, because I know that if Absalom were alive today and the rest of us dead, that would be perfectly fine with you. Now, get up. Go out and encourage your followers. I swear to the Lord that if you don't go out there, not one man will stick with you tonight. And that will be more trouble for you than all the trouble you faced from your youth until now." So the king went and sat down in the city gate. All the troops were told that the king was sitting in the gate, so they came before the king. Meanwhile, the Israelites had fled to their homes. Everyone was arguing throughout Israel's tribes, saying, The king delivered us from our enemy's power, and he rescued us from the Philistines' power. But now he has fled from the land and from controlling his own kingdom. And Absalom, the one we anointed over us, is dead in battle. So why do you say nothing about bringing the king back?" When the things that all the Israelites were saying reached the king, David sent a message to the priests, Zadok and Abiathar. "Say the following to the elders of Judah. Why should you be the last to bring the king back to his palace? You are my relatives. You are my flesh and bones. Why should you be the last to bring the king back? And tell Amasa, aren't you my flesh and bones too? May God deal harshly with me, and worse still, if you don't become commander of my army from now on instead of Joab." So he won over the hearts of everyone in Judah as though they were one person. And they sent word to the king, "Come back, you and all your servants." So the king came back and arrived at the Jordan River. Judah came to Gilgal to meet the king and bring him across the Jordan. Gera's son, Shimei, the Benjaminite from Bahurim, hurried down with the people of Judah to meet King David. 1,000 men from Benjamin were with him. Ziba, too, the servant of Saul's house, along with his 15 sons and 20 servants, rushed to the Jordan ahead of the king to do the work of ferrying over the king's household and to do whatever pleased him. Gera's son, Shimei, fell down before the king when he crossed the Jordan. He said to the king, "May my master not hold me guilty or remember your servant's wrongdoing, that day my master the king left Jerusalem. Please forget about it, your majesty, because your servant knows that I have sinned. But look, I am the first person from the entire family of Joseph to come down today and meet my master the king." Zeruiah's son Abishai responded, "Shouldn't Shimei be put to death for that, for cursing the Lord's anointed?" But David said, "My problems aren't yours, you sons of Zeruiah. Why are you becoming my enemy today? Should anyone in Israel be put to death today? Don't I know that today I am again king over Israel?" Then the king told Shimei, "You will not die." And the king swore this to him. Mephibosheth, Saul's grandson, also came down to meet the king. He hadn't taken care of his feet, trimmed his beard, or washed his clothes from the day the king left until the day he returned safely. When he came from Jerusalem to meet the king asked him, "Mephibosheth, why didn't you go with me?" "My master and king," Mephibosheth answered, "my servant abandoned me. Because your servant is lame, I asked my servant, 'Saddle a donkey for me so I can ride and go to the king.' So Ziba has slandered your servant to my master and king. But my master and king is a messenger of God. So do whatever seems best to you." Even though all the members of my grandfather's family were nothing short of demonic toward my master and king, you still put your servant with those who eat at your table. So what right do I have to beg for still more from the king?" "You don't need to talk any more about this," the king said to him. "I order you and Ziba to divide the property." Mephibosheth said to the king, "Let him take all of it, since my master and king has come home safely." Now Barzillai, the Gileadite, had come down from Rogelim. He accompanied the king to the Jordan River to send him off there. Barzillai was very old, 80 years of age. He had supported the king during his stay at Mahanaim because Barzillai was a very wealthy man. The king said to Barzillai, "Come over the Jordan with me. I will provide for you at my side in Jerusalem." But Barzillai said to the king, "How many years do I have left that I should go up with the king to Jerusalem? I am now 80 years old. Do I know what is good or bad anymore? Can your servant taste what I eat or drink? Can I even hear the voices of men or women singers? Why should your servant be a burden to my master and king? Your servant will cross a short way over the Jordan with the king. But why should the king give me such a reward?" Let your servant return, so I may die in my own town near the grave of my parents. But here is your servant Kimham. Let him cross over with my master and king, and treat him as you think best." The king said, "Okay, Kimham will cross over with me, and I will treat him as I think best, and I will do for you anything you desire of me." So all the people crossed over the Jordan River, and the king stayed behind. The king kissed Barzillai and blessed him, and then Barzillai went back to his home. When the king crossed over to Gilgal, Kimham went with him. All the troops of Judah and half the troops of Israel escorted the king across. Then everyone in Israel came and said to the king, "Why did our relatives, the people of Judah, steal you away and bring the king and his household across the Jordan River, along with all of his soldiers?" Then all the people of Judah answered the Israelites, "Because the king is our relative. Why are you angry at us about this? Have we taken any of the king's food? Has he given us any gifts?" But the Israelites answered the people of Judah, "We have 10 shares in the monarchy. What's more, we are the oldest offspring, not you. So why have you disrespected us? Weren't we the first to talk about bringing back our king?" But the words of the people of Judah were even harsher than the words of the Israelites. Now a despicable man named Sheba, Bichri's son, from Benjamin, was also there. He sounded the trumpet and said, "We don't care about David. We have no stake in Jesse's son. Go back to your homes, Israel." So all the Israelites left David to follow Bichri's son, Sheba. But all the people of Judah stayed close to their king from the Jordan River all the way to Jerusalem. When David arrived at his palace in Jerusalem, the king took the 10 secondary wives he had left to take care of the palace and put them in a house under guard. He provided for them, but he didn't have sex with them. They were confined until the day they died and lived like widows. Then the king said to Amasa, "Call everyone in Judah here to me 3 days from now. You should be here too." So Amasa went to call Judah together, but he took longer than the allotted time. David told Abishai, "Bichri's son Sheba will cause more trouble for us than Absalom did. Take your master's servants and chase after him before he finds fortified cities and escapes from us." So Joab's men marched out after Sheba. This included the Cherethites, the Pelethites, and all the warriors. They marched out of Jerusalem to pursue Bichri's son, Sheba. When they got to the great stone in Gibeon, Amasa came to meet them. Joab was dressed in his soldier's uniform. Over the tunic at his waist, he wore a sword in its sheath. As Joab went forward, it slipped out. "How are you, my brother?" Joab asked Amasa, and with his right hand he took hold of Amasa's beard as if to kiss him. But Amasa didn't notice the sword in Joab's hand. Joab struck him in the stomach with it, so that Amasa's intestines spilled out on the ground. He died without Joab, striking him a second time. Then Joab and his brother Abishai pursued Sheba, Bichri's son. One of Joab's men stood by Amasa and said, "Whoever favors Joab and whoever is for David, follow Joab." Amasa was writhing in blood in the middle of the road, and the man saw that everyone was stopping. When he saw this, he dragged Amasa from the road into a field and threw a robe over him. Once Amasa was moved out of the road, everyone who followed Joab marched past in pursuit of Bichri's son, Sheba. Sheba went through all the Israelite tribes up to Abel of Beth-maacah. All the Bichrites assembled and followed Sheba in. Then Joab's men arrived and attacked Sheba at Abel of Beth-maacah. They piled up a ramp against the city, and it stood against the outer wall. All of Joab's troops were hammering the wall, trying to bring it down. Then a wise woman called from the city, Listen, tell Joab to come over here so I can talk to him." So Joab approached her, and the woman said, "Are you Joab?" "I am," he answered. "Pay close attention to the words of your female servant," she said. "I'm listening," Joab replied. She said, "People used to say long ago, 'Ask your question at Abel.' And that settled the matter. I am one of the peaceful and faithful in Israel, but you are trying to kill a city that is one of Israel's mothers. Why would you annihilate the Lord's inheritance?" Joab answered, "I would never, ever annihilate or destroy such a thing. That's not the issue. A man named Sheba, Bichri's son, who is from the Ephraim highlands, has rebelled against King David. Just hand him over, and I'll leave the city alone." The woman said to Joab, "His head will be thrown over the wall to you." When the woman went to everyone with her wise counsel, they cut off the head of Sheba, Bichri's son, and threw it out to Joab. Then Joab sounded the trumpet, and his troops left the city, returning to their homes. But Joab returned to the king in Jerusalem. Now Joab was in command of Israel's army. Jehoiada's son Benaiah commanded the Cherethites and the Pelethites. Adoram was in charge of the forced labor. Ahilud's son Jehoshaphat was the recorder. Shiva was secretary. Zadok and Abiathar were priests. And Ira from Jair was also a priest for David. Dear Lord, you preserved David through these difficult years, and we are comforted by your preservation of the king. We also gain reassurance, knowing that you do the same for us. In Jesus' name, amen. We are in the heart of David's troublesome years. I think the Absalom factor cut David the deepest. Absalom was not in line for the throne, though there may have been a generational priority over Solomon. I mean, really, Solomon was the son of Bathsheba, a wife illicitly obtained. But be that as it may, David's affections for his women, plural, had created a sequence of events that birthed chaos and pained David the rest of his days. So here we are in the thick of the skirmish, caused by his pretty boy son, who felt he deserved even more than was due him. A strong motif today is seen in how David treats each and every one. In chapter 16, the revelation of loyalties versus disaffections, the treachery, and the intrigue of today's reading unfolds as a very high-stakes, life and death chess game. We never can tell what each person's next move is going to be. David is still en route fleeing Jerusalem, namely Absalom, his rebel son, when he encounters Mephibosheth's aide or servant, Ziba. Mephibosheth was Saul's grandson whom David was endeared to and took him in. David still honors Mephibosheth and Ziba despite the national tension. Then Shimei appears. He was a relative of Saul's. Shimei is an agitated soul and curses David. This was extremely foolish, since David is guarded by warriors who could kill Shimei at any moment. Oddly enough, David halts any possible retaliation and lets Shimei just yap away and throw dirt and rocks. This guy seemed like he was crazy. This seems to reveal that David is still feeling guilty. Seriously, the king being treated this way and musing about it being God's doing just isn't right. But all things considered, David is being overly gracious these days. Remember, David's attitude toward Absalom is basically, "Oh well, we'll just let him be king now, huh?" Next, Ahithophel reveals how far gone he is by advising Absalom to violate his father's concubines on a rooftop in view of all the people. Absalom, obliges. And what's crazier is that the people think this is great. In chapter 17, Ahithophel then advises that 12,000 soldiers should hunt down David, scatter the soldiers, and isolate David for the kill. Absalom, who's gone amok, loves the plan. Hushai intercepts at God's prompting and advises to pull in all Israel against David, knowing that this would give David time to annihilate Absalom's support. Hushai then goes completely stealth to spirit away and warn David of what's coming. Ahithophel learns his advice wasn't followed, so he goes home and hangs himself. Where did anyone think this turncoat rebel would end up? Meanwhile, refreshment and comfort is provided to David's men so they are ready for battle. In chapter 18, David snaps back into warrior mode. He organized these matters brilliantly under his command. On the departure, he gives this comment about Absalom that puzzles the men more than anything, and off they ride into battle. David's victory is swift and decisive as 20,000 of Absalom's loyalists, the Israelites, are killed. Absalom, fleeing on a mule, which is not exactly a valiant picture, gets hung by his hair in a tree. Joab learns of Absalom hanging in a tree, unable to get free, and thrusts him through with 3 javelins. Those are the sticks in today's translation, but now you can picture it. They're javelins. This rebellion ends. The victory is grand, though grievous for David, as his son was killed. He leaves his men in a bit of a lurch as he's mourning Absalom's death in a rather protracted and insistent manner. The victory for him was an internal conflict that he couldn't resolve. In chapter 19, General Joab's heated monologue of exhortation snaps David out of his mourning. At this point, it seems Joab is perhaps more into David and the kingdom than even David is. A rally cry arises, and David is called to return and resume as king of Israel. During the return, Shimei, who was the one yelling at him on his way out, comes forward with his sappy apology, falling prostrate before David. David's graciousness was more than Shimei deserved for cursing the king. During the journey back to Jerusalem, we see David handling many interactions that show his regal character in forgiving Shimei, interacting tenderly and wisely with Mephibosheth and Ziba, being grateful to Barzillai and Kimham. We see a tussle argument break out between Israel, the conglomerate of the 10 tribes of the north, and Judah, the chief tribe of the south. It's a harbinger of what is going to happen 2 generations later when, upon Solomon's death, the north splits away. Chapter 20. Hey, all's good, right? We're heading back to Jerusalem and the rebellion is over. Right? Well, no. Sheba, a Benjaminite, rallied Israel against David, and they followed Sheba against David. Well, that was pretty quick. David, acting quickly, puts Amasa on task to assemble Judah to stop this rebellion. Amasa was taking too long, so his question of loyalty came into play, and who steps forward to ante up, kill Amasa, and rouse the army? Joab. You could say that Joab was like the Patton of World War II or the Sherman during the Civil War. He was doggedly patriotic and loyal to David, almost more Davidic than King David was. He pursued Sheba like a cheetah after a gazelle to where he was hiding out in Abel. And Joab didn't stop until Sheba's head was thrown over the wall and landed amid Joab's army. The intervention of a wise woman in Abel was what spared bloodshed on both sides and the city of Abel Beth-Maacah being razed to rubble. Whew, what a read. We had lots of action today. Boy, how do you feel? I feel like I just had another great workout. 7streamsmethod.com is the home port for this podcast. Tomorrow we transition to the wisdom stream into the book of Psalms, and know that nothing can separate you from the love of God. Until tomorrow, I'm Serena, sailing with you down the 7 streams.